Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fascinating question.
Hmm.
How do these armed groups, the ones often called terrorists, actually manage to become political players once they, seize power?
Right. And we're looking at this less through the lens of ideology or justice even.
Exactly. We're
Yeah.
focusing squarely on the strategy, the power-hungry perspective, you could say.
It's about understanding the playbook, the calculated moves they make to consolidate control and gain legitimacy, or at least some form of it. Not about judging the cause.
And we've got some great source material you sent over. We'll be digging into examples like the Taliban's return in Afghanistan,
Sudan's RSF, Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course.
plus different Syrian rebel factions like the FSA and HTS, and even going back to Somali's Islamic Courts Union.
A real mix, but they all shed light on this transformation process.
Yeah, so our mission here, for you listening, is to cut through the complexity. We want to understand the strategies these groups use to gain and keep power, maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way without getting bogged down.
Okay, let's dive in.
So first things first, seizing power. That initial step seems absolutely crucial, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely fundamental. Capturing territory, maybe a key city, definitely the capital.
Yeah.
That's the pivot point.
It signals they're not just fighting anymore.
Precisely. They're shifting from insurgency to, well, aspiring rulers. It's about making a claim.
And the goal isn't just winning a battle here or there. It's about permanent control, right?
Yeah.
Laying that foundation.
Exactly. The violence itself becomes a means to that end, building towards lasting rule.
The Taliban's return in Afghanistan back in 2021 seems like such a clear case study of this.
It really does. I mean, they went from active fighting to almost immediately making these public promises. Amnesty, diplomatic talks.
The engagement in Qatar, seeking foreign aid. It was a very sudden change in public posture, wasn't it? Even while they were cementing control internally.
A very rapid shift in presentation.
How much did that actually work, though? Did those optics help them get aid or ease sanctions?
Well, it's interesting. The rhetoric, the promises of amnesty, a more inclusive government, that definitely seemed aimed at international players.
Trying to calm fears.
Yeah, trying to ease concerns, potentially unlock aid, which they desperately needed. Now, whether they followed through on those promises, that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But the strategic intent of that messaging seems pretty clear.
Okay.
And you see something similar, perhaps, with the RSF in Sudan. Despite their difficult origins and the very serious accusations against them, they've become this dominant military faction, and now they're central to any political negotiation.
Their power isn't just guns, then.
Not solely. It's also their control over key infrastructure, resources. That gives them huge leverage in talks.
Okay, so they've grabbed control, but moving from being seen as, extremists to something that looks like a government, how does that happen? Rebranding seems key.
Absolutely key. Once they're in power, you often see this very deliberate effort to shed the old labels. Yeah. Terrorist, insurgent, they want those gone.
And they start acting like a state.
Exactly. Issuing decrees, controlling borders, managing trade routes, maybe even holding elections.
Even if the elections are, shall we say, questionable.
Regardless of fairness, yeah.
Oh.
Some even set up structures that look like government ministries. It's all part of projecting authority.
So is this like a genuine change of heart
Mm-hmm.
or just a tactic?
Overwhelmingly, it looks strategic. It's realpolitik, isn't it? Image becomes a tool.
A tool for what?
For access, resources, foreign investment, influence. Presenting yourself as a stable governing body, not just fighters, is crucial for that.
Which brings us to the international stage. That becomes another arena for power, right? Not just domestic control.
Oh, absolutely critical. From their strategic viewpoint, international recognition isn't some moral prize. It's a lever to increase their power.
So they actively pursue it.
Yes, seeking meetings with powerful countries, showing up at peace talks, lobbying hard to get sanctions lifted, trying to get a seat at the table in international bodies.
It's like they're saying, look, we're the ones actually in charge here. You kind of have to deal with us.
Pretty much. And they often get quite good at playing the game, using global tensions.
Oh, so?
Well, leveraging geopolitical rivalries, playing China off against the West, or maybe Russia against the U.S., or using regional powers like Turkey or Iran to their advantage.
Finding allies of convenience.
Exactly. Look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's a really complex case, designated a terrorist group by some countries.
Right.
But they hold significant political power within Lebanon, run social services, and they absolutely engage in international negotiations. It's part of their long-game strategy to cement their position.
Now, something else the sources highlighted was this tactic of using the stability narrative. That sounds quite clever, actually.
Yes, it's a very shrewd move. These groups often position themselves as the only ones who can bring order back.
Especially if it's order following chaos they might have helped create.
Or at least chaos they've exploited. They step into a vacuum, or worsen existing instability, and then say, see, only we can fix this.
So manufacturing the need for their own rule, in a way?
Essentially, yes. They create this dependency. Domestically, people might just want the fighting to start. Internationally, other actors might see them as the least bad option.
It's a powerful way to consolidate their grip, isn't it?
It really is. A chillingly effective tactic, like
Yeah.
a perversion of the social contract almost.
And over time, does this just become normal? Their rule gets accepted, even without genuine legitimacy.
That's often what happens. It normalizes out of sheer pragmatism. Aid agencies need to deliver aid. Companies might want to do business. Rival countries find they have to engage on some level.
Practicality wins out.
From the group's strategic perspective, legitimacy isn't something granted by others. It's something you take through control, and eventually that often reluctant recognition follows.
It's clearly a very calculated path, but as we saw in the sources, success isn't guaranteed. Let's dig into some of those specific cases more. Syria, for instance. The FSA and HTS. What can we learn there?
Syria is a really good, if tragic, illustration of the different ways this can play out. You had the Free Syrian Army, the FSA.
Right, they had some early Western support aimed to be a more moderate force against Assad.
They did. But ultimately, they struggled. Internal divisions, corruption became a big problem, and they just couldn't unify politically.
So from that power perspective we're using.
From that perspective, they largely failed to consolidate power effectively. The ambition was there, but not the execution needed for stable governance.
Okay, so they couldn't make the transition. What about HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? They have roots in al-Qaeda, right?
Yes, but their trajectory is different. Once they gained control in places like Idlib province, they made a very conscious effort to govern.
How so?
Setting up civil bodies, collecting taxes, holding press briefings, managing local affairs. It was a clear strategic pivot.
Moving away from just being jihadists.
Towards acting like an administration, aiming for long-term power, not just immediate fighting. A very pragmatic shift.
Right, from fighting to running things.
Pretty much. And they used other strategies, too. Cultivating ties with regional players, like Turkey. Using humanitarian aid flows to prop up their governance.
And seeking recognition.
Oh, yes. Demanding political recognition became a key part of their survival strategy.
Interesting. Okay, let's switch gears to Somalia. The Islamic Courts Union, the ICU. They seem to gain a lot of initial support.
They did, back in the early 2000s. It's a classic example of stepping into a power vacuum. Mogadishu was ruled by warlords. It was chaos.
And the ICU brought order?
Relatively speaking, yes. They restored a degree of law and order, and that gained them huge popular backing initially. This allowed them to act like a de facto government, providing services, setting up a council. They clearly had national ambitions.
So internally, they made that jump from armed group to governing body quite well.
For a time, yes, but their downfall really highlights another crucial factor.
Which is?
Managing international perception and not overreaching too fast.
Ah, what happened?
Well, their rapid success, and perhaps some of their stricter interpretations of Islamic law, really alarmed neighboring Ethiopia and the U.S.
They worried about another Taliban-style state.
That was the fear, yes. A hardline Islamist state in the Horn of Africa. That fear ultimately led to the Ethiopian invasion in 2006 with U.S. backing, and that ousted the ICU.
So a stark lesson that controlling territory isn't enough if powerful external actors see you as a major threat.
Exactly. Their failure wasn't necessarily in governing itself, at least initially, but in navigating that international dimension. They couldn't manage the threat perception.
And
Ironically, their collapse paved the way for al-Shabaab, a much more radical splinter group.
Which, despite its ideology, also uses governance tactics.
Yes, in the areas it controls, al-Shabaab imposes its own form of order, collects taxes, runs courts. Similar tactics, different group, different ideology, but still focused on control.
Okay, so looking across all these examples, Taliban, Syria, Somalia, what are the core lessons from this sort of power-hungry viewpoint?
Well, if we synthesize it, you see these recurring traits. The Taliban, successful power seizure, definite rebranding efforts, actively seeking international engagement and aid, a clear path from insurgency to rule.
Right.
Syrian rebels, a mixed bag. Some, like HTS, pursued governance and legitimacy, playing regional politics. Others, like parts of the FSA, fragmented and failed to consolidate. Objectives weren't always aligned with strategy.
Okay.
Somali ICU. Effective initially at filling the vacuum, gained popular support through order, but misjudged the external reaction. Moved too fast, perhaps.
Underestimated the neighbors and the U.S.
And al-Shabaab rejects diplomacy, minimal rebranding, but still mimics state functions for control and resources in its territory. Order, but through harsh means.
It really drives home the point, doesn't it, that this push for legitimacy isn't necessarily about believing in democracy or human rights or any specific ideology?
Exactly. For these groups, from this strategic perspective we're examining, legitimacy is primarily a tool, a means to an end.
In the end is.
Power.
Yeah.
Acquiring it, keeping it, controlling the state, managing perceptions inside and outside, and outmaneuvering rivals. That's the core objective.
So, wrapping up our deep dive today, what's the main takeaway for you, for our listeners?
I think the key insight is that this transformation armed group to political player is very often driven by cold, hard pragmatism and the pursuit of power, not some deep ideological conversion.
It's about strategy.
It's about strategy, rebranding, diplomacy when useful, control. These are the essential tactics for survival and entrenchment.
Okay, fascinating stuff. And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to consider. How does understanding this raw, power-focused dynamic maybe reshape how you look at current conflicts around the world? What happens long-term when pragmatism really does trump ideology in the quest to govern?
Something to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.